Hi, I'm Vince Morfuni, and on behalf of the Australian Calabrese Cultural Association, I'd like to welcome you on the program Sono Calabrese, a series of interviews with members of our community in which they recount some of their experiences and some of the contributions that they've made to the community. Tonight, we're very honoured to have, for the first time, an internationally known artist and indeed the first humorist to be interviewed. And I'm referring, of course, to Joe Avati, who would be well known to most of you. And welcome, Joe, and thank you very much for giving up your time and participating in our program.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I've been looking forward to this. I always enjoy talking about being Calabrese. I hope you got some juicy questions for me.
Good. I hope I have also. Indeed, as you know, what we endeavour to do here is to present what some people would perhaps say are ordinary Calabrese and the work that they've done in the community, in contradistinction to the stereotypical picture that's often presented in the mainstream media.
Yes.
And as you know, I take it you were born in Australia.
Yes. So I was born in Australia in 1974. My father was born in Calabria, Reggio Calabria. My mother was born in Australia, and her parents were born in Calabria but met and married in Australia. They were from the same Paese back home, Melicuca and Reggio Calabria. But my nonna, my mum's mum came to Australia in 1949. My mum's dad came in 1951. They married in 1952,
Right.
and my mother was born in 1950.
So your nonni would have been in that first wave of migrants following the Second World War.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yes, that's
do
right.
you know much about what your nonni did in Calabria? Did they work the land or did they?
Yeah. Well, both sets of grandparents worked the land. My nonno, my mum's father, he was a prisoner of war for a very long time in a place called Asmara, Eritrea, with the
Right.
British. In fact, he learned to read and write English with the British. And right here in my special cupboard in my office here, I've got a book. It's actually which was presented to me on my 40th birthday from my nonna, in which you can see my nonno, his handwriting, and where he learnt to read and write English. So when he arrived in Australia, he was one of the very few back in those days who could actually read and write English.
Right. And that's interesting because, well, if he arrived in 1950-51,
51, yep.
that that would have been around the time there was in fact a significant depression in Australia at that time. So his
Yes.
knowledge of English would have assisted him in obtaining employment and
That's
probably
right, and he actually used to help a lot of the other paesani
yeah.
with their certificates that they needed to come to Australia. He used to also assist them with their tax, like a pseudo accountant, if you like.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think he settled in Sydney. Is that
That's right. So both sets of grandparents settled in Sydney. I'm from Sydney. I only moved to Melbourne 10 years ago,
okay?
but he both sets of families settled in Sydney. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you've got or you had one brother,
Yes.
as I
Yes.
understand it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, one brother, and sadly he passed away on the 4th of March in 2019 after a long illness. We miss him very much, but
yeah.
such is
Sorry,
life. Yeah.
sorry to hear that. And what work did your parents do?
So my parents had a number of businesses. I remember my dad in the beginning when I was growing up. They were in the rag trade. They were in the restaurant businesses. They were in interior design and interior fit outs, and also uh, uh, more recently, a lot in finance. Basically, yeah. So they moved around, but mainly we had our own businesses a lot, which was great for me because I learned a lot about being a businessman.
Yeah, and did you live with your nonni or
Absolutely. There was a time when
yeah,
we because when we were in between homes, I think we were renovating a home, so we were living with our nonni. But also, see, what happened was on my father's side. So my mum and dad got married October 1973. My dad's two brothers, his four sisters, my nonna, extended aunties and uncles, all arrived the week of my parents' wedding,
right?
and I was born, very soon after. Because if you want to know how long an Italian couple's been married for, it's what you do is you get the eldest son and 1 year, and that's how long. So I'm 46. My mum and dad have been married. No surprise, 47
47.
years. Actually, 46 years and 9 months.
That's good maths.
Yeah. Well, that's what I call it. It's Calabrese maths. Anyway, the point that I'm making is that I grew up in the arms of some 15 immediate family members who didn't speak English at all. So essentially, if you think about it, so they've all arrived 1973 October. I was born August 1974. They didn't speak English. All the whole family and I was the second grandchild, and I was named after my grandfather, so I was the golden child, right? That's where I learned to speak Calabrese. So essentially, I learned to speak Calabrese before I learned to speak English, because my mum spoke Calabrese very well too, even though she was born in Australia.
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of children like you, when they first went to school,
Yeah,
they didn't speak English because
No.
all that was spoken in the family was
That's right.
Calabrese.
Yes.
Was that your experience as well?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but I can imagine it would have been, because all of my father's family didn't speak English, and so I learned to speak Calabrese there. My mother's side, they spoke English very well. My grandparents on my mother's side spoke English extremely well, actually. So I would have got a bit of both from coming in. I mean, I remember, up until even when a month before my grandfather passed away 10 years ago on my mum's side, he was sitting down on the daily reading the Daily Telegraph
Right,
or the crosswords,
right.
So his grasp of the English language was like anybody
Pretty
else's,
good.
really.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I read that you went to 3 different high schools.
Yes.
Is that because you were a troubled student, or because your parents moved?
No, my parents moved. I always like to say we were in the witness protection program, but that's just for a joke, But no, in all sincerity, in all honesty, we just moved around, different businesses, different opportunities, that my dad and mum had. I actually went to 4 primary schools and 3 high schools. Now, some people might look at that as being disruptive. I actually found it gave me the basic foundations that I have now, so I can easily get up and move and travel wherever I need to travel, and it doesn't faze me.
Right.
Right? I can sleep anywhere, I can stay anywhere, adapt to any particular situation, and I find that people who one of the characteristics of someone who's successful is to be able to deal quickly, swiftly, and efficiently with change.
Yeah. Oh, the adaptability to change,
Yeah.
and the lack of fear of uncertainty, basically, that
Yeah.
change entails. But do you have a recollection of high school? And
Yeah, I was never really big into school. As a child, and this might sound really funny to the people watching, because of what I do, but I was extremely shy. And I remember being a loner. I remember walking around the playground alone, looking at kids, making commentary in my head, thinking, what are those kids wearing that? Why are they playing that? Why is he saying that? Why is he? And so, because of that, I started this process of analyzing, and I remember doing that. And then as I went on, and then of course, when you change schools so often, by the time you become friends with someone, you're moving on.
yeah,
So you don't actually have really long-term relationship or friendships at that stage.
you mentioned that you're shy.
Yeah.
I've also read that conversely, you've always wanted to be famous,
Yes.
and
Yes.
initially you wanted to be a pop star.
I wanted to be a rock star. Yes, I did. I wanted to be George Michael, and I wanted to be the Beatles. I remember, because we used to live in Queensland back then, and at the time, my dad said, we're gonna rush home. I've got a surprise for you." I'm thinking, wow, what's this surprise? But really, just being an Italian dad, he wanted to rush home because the soccer was on, because there was a big game happening from Italy, right? So we all had to rush home because it was a surprise, but really it was because he wanted to watch the soccer. But for some reason, they couldn't air the soccer. They couldn't broadcast it for some reason. We're talking that in the 80s, in the early 80s. So instead, what they showed was a documentary on the Beatles. And I remember watching the documentary as a 7, 8 year old and thinking to myself, what's that transaction? The transaction between these guys on stage and all these people in the audience. And I was fascinated by that transaction. And I started to pursue what that was about. Okay, so these people are famous. So being famous is going to create this hysteria with all these girls screaming. And I loved the thought of that attention.
Yeah.
So I started playing the tennis racket. You know,
The ghost guitar.
yeah, so that's how I started the tennis racket,
Yeah.
and and it moved on from there. And then became obsessed with the Beatles. I became obsessed with their music, and then it moved over to Duran Duran and George Michael, and then it just, as I was becoming a teenager, it really expanded after that, and so that was it for me. I was going to be a rock star. That is where I was going. No one was stopping me. I started to learn guitar. I started to teach myself the piano. I was writing songs. I was writing words, poetry. I ended up studying a composition major at school, writing classical piano music without ever having a piano lesson in my life. All these kind of things, which were really, really interesting. But when I got to year 12, and my dad said, "What do you want to do?" I want to be a rock star. He said, "No, in Calabria, there's no rock stars." That's what he said. No, if you to Calabria, don't just only rock star. No,
Yeah. No.
find something else. So I ended up doing food science.
Guadagna moneta, no?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, my dad. It was really interesting because I was having a guitar lesson, and the guitar teacher at the time was I can't remember his name, but he was so he taught guitar, but his main bread and butter was he was there was a big musical in town called Starlight Express, and so when these big musicals came to Australia, it was his job to play the guitar in hidden behind the stage and so on. And he rocked up to my house one day in a shitty old Datsun 280B. And my dad looked at it and he made a point. He goes, "And this guy here is one of the best guitarists
Yeah.
in Australia. And this is the car he drives." No, feed you. Yeah. I think you might want to look at doing something else.
That's true. And there is that incongruity, isn't there, between you being very shy
Yeah.
and yet, and you still say, as I've read that in relation to the crowd, you say, I still get embarrassed by being in front of a crowd.
Yeah.
Some performers want to see the audience. I don't want to see anybody. It's much easier for me to perform to darkness.
That's right. Because if you think about it, when you were younger, like when I was saying I used to play the tennis racket, if I'm in my room, and this happens to a lot of people, it's like young girls will sing into a hairbrush, right, in front of the mirror, wanting to be, I don't know, Madonna, Britney Spears, whatever it was. When there's nobody looking, you're a lot more animated. You're not shy. You're out because there's nobody looking. Nobody can judge you. You know that whole saying, "Dance like nobody's watching," and it's the same thing. When there's darkness, when I can't see anybody, I pretend there's nobody there. I become a different person on stage, as opposed to being able to see people. And one of the hardest things for me is when I'm performing in a venue where I have to walk through the audience to get on stage. That's fine. But at the end, when I have to walk through the audience after I've finished, oh, that just gets me. That just,
So,
I don't know why. I mean, it's not that like the show was bad. It was a great show, but I just get embarrassed. I don't know why. I'm shy. I'm just
yeah,
inherently
yeah.
a shy person.
But conversely,
Yeah,
you see, there's the element you actually involve the audience. You say you'd like to be in the
yeah,
date, but who's from here, who's from there, how many
yeah.
teenagers?
That comes with confidence over time. Yeah, and now I make it part of the show. So I'll drag a teenager through the show. I'll find the non-ethnic. I'll find the Aussie, the Anglo-Saxon through the show.
I've got a question for you because you're the only one who can answer. On behalf of all the wogs in the room, what was school camp like? Because we were never allowed to go.
And I'll make them part of the show and I'll thread them throughout it. It makes it a lot more interesting and adds an element of theatre.
You also say that in relation to your comedy, that it's great challenge to be able to take an audience on a journey and to build them up. to a frenzy where they are giving you a standing ovation. Is that the satisfaction that you get in terms of a performance where you get someone presumably you don't know, and suddenly through your comedy, they react in a way that is positive to you?
Yeah, well, when you break down what stand-up comedy does or is, basically you are asking a room full of strangers to you, and more often than not, unless they come in a group, strangers to one another. You are asking them, whether it be 530 or 5,000 people, to have a simultaneous involuntary reaction to what you say. In other words, involuntary reaction is laughter. So you're asking a room full of strangers to laugh at the same time at what you're saying. That's, in a nutshell, what stand-up comedy is. There's a great satisfaction to be able to have that instant gratification. I mean, if you're a movie producer, you produce a movie, you got to edit it, market it, put it out there, get reviews. By the time you get, this is sometimes a year and a half, 2 year long project. When you do stand-up, you're up there, you'll know in 30 seconds how you're going. And you keep on knowing every 20 or 30 seconds how you're progressing. It's instant. And I think I like that part of it.
That would, from my perspective, have to be the most difficult gig that you can do, as you say, to essentially stand there, expose yourself, or at least your mental process, and expect people to react positively.
And for an hour and a half, non-stop, or 90 minutes.
What I also want you to comment on is, what is it that you find funny?
What makes me laugh is very different to what I do in my show. I like people who really push the envelope in terms of their comedy, but I do like observation as well. What makes me laugh is the characters, how sometimes, and you see a lot of these characters in the ethnic type of shows that we do, where you've got the uncle, he just goes about doing whatever he wants the way he would have done it in Italy, but in an Anglo-Saxon environment, and just doesn't care. I find that very funny. Totally oblivious to what's going on around him. Just keeps on going. And we find a lot with I had this character where I would talk about the uncle who stuffed up the English language, and he talks to you straight to your eye, and he's got no idea that he's stuffing up the language. He's so confident with his English. He's got no idea that he's stuffing it up, and he just keeps on going. There's a sense of brilliance in that, and there's a lot of humor in that as well.
Yeah. Well, and essentially, I mean, there's different types of humor, but what I've perceived in your shows that I've seen is you're basically bridging that gap between your nonni and perhaps even your own parents, and what might be called the dominant culture or the Anglo-Celtic environment. But you do it in a way which is both comforting and challenging, because from what I see, you take something which someone would perhaps see as very insulting, and you twist it in a way that it's funny. So, for example, one of my favourite examples is that I've heard you is when you've got a routine where you say you're going along, and then someone in the audience says, "Go, why don't you go home?"
All right.
And you say, "Which one? I got a 5."
Yeah, that's right. Which house I got? I think that was a joke about Pauline Hanson.
Exactly.
All you wogs should go back to where you come from. Go back home. And my nonna goes, "Which one? I got a 5." Which house?
Rather, and that's what I think is very interesting. And even though people, they might think call it ethnic humour, but it's trying to get someone to see both the error of the Pauline Hanson view and the fact that the people that they're being told to go home have been here for a very long time, and
they've been very successful.
And well, that's the point. That
and they made a life for themselves. And look, I always make sure in the show I pointed out that we always address and we always acknowledge our parents and our grandparents. And I always say that because they were the ones at the end of the day who had the guts and the courage to come to countries like Australia, not knowing the language, not knowing where they were going to perform, and they did it for us more often than not, their unborn grandchildren, right? And they made the best out of it. What came out of that was funny was the fact that, and I always say this, if you got 4 people from the same little village in Italy, one went to Canada, one went to England, one went to Australia, one went to America, and then you fast forward 40 years, so that none of these 4 people have spoken to each other, none of them have had communication with each other at all. You fast forward 40 years and you have a look at their lives and you go into their lounge rooms. Each one of them would have a couch with plastic on it. Why? Why is that? And you know, I've been sort of studying this for a long time. Why is it? And the reason is because back home in Italy, when they had to work hard to have nice things, but here they worked just as hard and they could now afford even nicer things. So that nice couch that they can afford now, they worked so hard for it. They appreciate it. They don't want to ruin it. So how do you do that? You protect it. How do you protect it? You put plastic on it, or you leave them. And you know what? That happened to me when I first moved to Melbourne. I went to South Yarra. I had a brand new dinner set, brand new dinner table, 6 chairs. It took me, Vincent, about 5 months to get the courage to take off the plastic off the chairs. And I'm going, I'm doing what my uncles and aunties at Kupari used to do. And wow, isn't that funny how it's now gone into my generation?
And your humour is obviously based on your experiences, either as a child or growing up. So it's got a very Calabrese basis to it. And does that define who you are?
I think what defines myself in terms of the style of humour that I have, because a lot of people ask me now, like, for example, I do a lot of corporate work, right? I'll go to an organisation, nothing to do with being Italian. Sometimes I'll do Anzac dinners, right? And there's not one Italian in sight. All older Australians, Anzacs, return services people, and they'll get me to do a show there. And people go, but how are they going to understand? And what a lot of people don't realise, it's the same when people say, oh, you're really big in Canada, right? But what they have no idea about is that I do a lot of shows in England. I'm really big in America as well. But because that they saw those clips a lot that came back to Australia from Canada, they realised that. So a lot of people who saw my early comedy saw that I was doing it in half English and half Calabrese. So they think that that's what I still do. I do a lot of material that's sure I give it a slant to that ethnic slant, but there's a lot that I do which has got nothing to do with being ethnic. And so I guess what really defines my style of humor is the observations that I make. So whether it be about being Calabrese, or whether it be about Donald Trump, or whether it be about the differences between growing up in the 80s versus now. None of those things have got anything to do with being Calabrese. It's the observation that I make about that particular topic. And that's my style. And that's, I think, what defines me.
What's the process that you follow? How do you write a routine?
Well, there's various different ways. Firstly, there's the way that I hate doing is the sitting down. Okay, right, new show, I have to write something. That's not natural to me, but sometimes you have to do it. And in that respect, you just have to think of idea. Or you might have a funny idea. Like I've got a book this thick of old ideas, which might not be funny there. I can't think of a tagline, but I'll revisit it every 6 months. I'll look at it and go, oh, right, now I can make this funny. So there's that way. Another way that I find is that a lot of people write to me. So a lot of fans will write on Facebook, on Instagram, will come up to me after a show and they will tell me their own experience, or they'll tell me a story that happened to them, or they will say to me, hey, maybe have you looked at it like this? So I'll make a note of it and then expand on it. A lot of the time back in the day, because I used to do so many shows, I used to write on stage while I was performing. If I was very comfortable on stage and I had a great audience, I would just grab a character, the nonno, and ad lib in that routine, and then keep adding and adding and adding to it. And some of my routines now, if you come and see the show, you'll hear a routine that I performed 15 years ago, which started off a minute and a half and now is a 12-minute routine. And this is a routine that's constantly being shaped and formed and molded, changed here and there. Like there's this one routine about my nono and nonna fighting, which I've been doing for about 15 years. And last year I added a brand new bit to it, which is probably the funniest part of that whole routine now. And I changed one little bit in it, but it made it extremely funny. And it's very interesting. It depends where you saw my show. When was the last time you saw my show, or how many years ago? If you saw my show 15 years ago and you come to the show, you go, wow, it's all brand new. If you came last year and then you saw it again, all right, there's a few little tweaks here and there. But next year, I'm going to be on the road with a brand new show, and I'm in the middle of writing something for it now. And this is the first time where I'm sitting down and writing, like forcing myself to write. But it is, after 25 years, a lot easier now than it was 10 years ago.
And of course, some say that improvisation is the lifeblood of stand-up comedy. So you've got to be able to work your audience in that sense, get a feel of what they think is funny and continue along, even if it's not part of the original script.
Exactly. And you know what? Sometimes I will say something and I will burst out laughing because that's the first time I've heard it in my head. Yeah. And I've said it and I start laughing. And more often than not, there's always someone who's working for me, my tour manager, the sound guy, a friend of mine in the audience, and I'll just say, make sure, can someone write that down, please? Yeah. And just give that line to me at the end of the show so I know what it was, because otherwise I'll forget. Yeah. And then I go, wow, okay, so that really worked. So the next time I do a show and I get to that routine, I grab that line that I just made up on the spot last week and insert it and keep it expanding on it.
Yeah, and I must say, I was taken, I think it was your 20th anniversary tour show.
Right.
Which I assume it wasn't part of the script, but in the show, I think you say, look, people ask me, why do I do this?
Right.
And the answer that you gave is because I do this because we find out who we are.
Yeah, sure.
Is that what drives you?
Okay, so I started doing all this by sitting. I've got a lot of cousins, right? So I've got 18 first cousins, or 17. There was 17, 18.
Once, one or two,
Yeah. And I started just wanting to make my cousins laugh.
Right.
Impersonating one of Mud Seals, or one of our, we'd have to go to do a visit, or we'd have the visit to come over our house. Yeah. And I go, what about the kumpari? He was like this and like that, and this was one of his characteristics. And I started doing that. That's how I started to realize that, oh, geez, I'm onto something here. Everyone will go, oh, Joe, do that impression of Seal. Do what did Sia say? What did Nonna say when you first ring her up? All that kind of stuff. And that's how it started. That seed was planted in my head about, being a stand-up.
I infer that you're one of these people that uses humour to control the situation, even when you're not on the stage.
Absolutely. I mean, especially because at school, I was a loner. And to make friends, everyone loves a funny guy, right? So I learned to be funny because, if I went around bullying people, if I ran around pulling people's hair, calling people's names, I wouldn't be popular. I needed to be popular. I needed to be liked, and liked really quickly. So what's the quickest way to be liked really quickly? Is to be funny. And you use it as a tool to get through life. And when you're doing that from 7 and 8 year old, and you're really, what you're doing is you're practicing comedy. I didn't know I was going to be a stand-up comedian when I was 7 or 8 years old. But really, all those years of doing that, then it's no wonder I was 21 and on stage performing to people.
Although you had a little detour where you actually worked in the food industry.
I have a double degree in science, majoring in food science. Got out of that and worked in a company, and I helped invent a little ice cream I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it. It's called the Magnum.
Yeah, a big favourite.
So I was on part of the team that helped develop Magnum ice cream in Australia for streets.
Yeah,
So for a long time, that was my claim to fame. And for
yeah,
a long time, there were a lot of women
yeah,
who had my face on dartboards.
exactly. And issue that you explore even in your shows is the fact that, as I said earlier, you're caught in the middle because here
Yeah.
you're looked on as a wog,
Yes.
but you went to Calabria
Yeah. And I'm
and
Americano.
you were an Americano.
Yeah. So who was I? And this. I'm glad you brought this up, Vincent, because this is a really interesting point with my work. I think. See, a lot of children of my generation didn't know where they belonged. Okay, so I go to school Monday to Friday. Mainly, some of the schools that I went to, there was ethnics. In some of the schools that I went to, my brother and I were one of the very few ethnic kids. So we used to mix with the Anglo-Saxons. But come Friday, come Saturday, Sunday, we would do things that were very Italian. We'd go to do the visite, where your mum looks at your brother and me in the backyard and goes, "Don't touch the biscuit or I'll kill you." I wonder, when I used to get to school on Monday, I wonder if Shane had to do the visite. I wonder if his mum ever said, "Don't touch the meat pie or I'll kill you."
Or you'll die.
Yeah, we'd do the tomato sauce. We'd go to big ethnic weddings. We'd go to our nonni's place, like every Sunday lunch, we're at my mum's parents'. Every Sunday dinner, without fail, every week, we're at my parents' place, my nonni and my dad's side. Then you'd be entrenched in these Italian traditions for 2 days straight. Then come Monday, you go to school and you start to look around and you go, you feel alien. And about Tuesday, Wednesday, you start to settle back into being normal again. So I didn't feel Italian, entirely Italian. I didn't feel entirely Australian. So who was I? And I think that my comedy, and like I felt that millions of other children of Italian immigrants all over the world felt that. And so that's, by talking about it on stage, a lot of people thought, wow, I'm not the only one who's gone through that. I'm not the only one who wasn't allowed not to go to school camp. I thought I was the only one who wasn't allowed to go. But Joe wasn't either. And there's a whole audience laughing. So his whole audience weren't allowed to go either. And so that made people feel like they belonged. Wow. So this guy's work is my life, right? It's the same as somebody loves a singer. I like George Michael. Why? Because George Michael's songs were the anthem of my upbringing. I went through years of listening to his songs, able to relate to his songs, and they meant something to me back then. The same way that happened with him is the same way that a lot of children of Italian immigrants felt for themselves. So my work was able to define a point in their life. And when you can put out a body of work that lasts for a very long time, that is able to define where somebody belongs, it gives them a sense of identity, that is very powerful. And people don't forget that. And they have this instant affinity to you. And it's like when they see you in the street, you're a total stranger, really. But they feel like they know you. It happens all the time. People have no problem coming up to me and saying hello. They feel like I'm their cugino. And that's pretty cool to be able to do that,
That is, and I think it indicates that you've brought to the forefront of consciousness what had previously been submerged, as you say. People led double lives.
Yes.
They were
Yep.
Aussies outside the home and Calabrese within the home.
Yes.
But more importantly, you brought bits of the culture to the attention of the broader community as well, so they could see it and say, well, it's not bad, or some parts of it are good, and that's why it resonates. Now, I think what the issue arises is, have we moved on? In other words, are your kids going to have the same issues that you had? In other words, am I Calabrese, am I an Aussie or whatever, or am I both? And,
Well, here's something that's very interesting, Vincent. As a kid, I remember Italy winning the World Cup, right? 1982. Paolo Rossi, who just passed away, Paolo Rossi's team won the World Cup. I remember that. And I remember going for Italy. The 1990, so that was 1982. The 1990 World Cup was in Italy. I remember going barracking for Italy. As the years went on, and I would go to Italy and I'd come back and start to realise who I was. I think it was a 1996 World Cup when Italy played Australia. I could be mistaken in that year. I don't know. If forgive me if I'm wrong on that year, but the year doesn't really matter. What the point that I'm making is when Italy played Australia, I was like, who do I go for? I didn't. And that night, I realised that I was an Aussie. I was an Aussie Italian. Up until that point, I was an Italian Australian, and I switched that night. Why? Because when Italy were about to go and score a goal against Australia, I was like, "Oh no!" That was my natural instinct.
Yeah.
Was to then say, "No, please don't score against us." Or when Australia was going to score, I was going, "Yeah, come on, get it." And I realised that night there were Italian kids in that room who were born in Australia, whose parents were born in Australia, but they were waving Italian flags. How do you explain that? And the simple answer to that is because people want to be attached to the winner. They want to be associated with the best. So who are they going to go for? Italy, because Italy, is always going to be up there, right? It's a natural instinct that humans have. But why do these kids who were born in Australia, whose parents were born in Australia, waving Italian flags? So to answer your question, yeah, possibly my children, when they grow up, are going to want to be more Italian than they are Australian.
And then there's nothing wrong in it. You see, I think the real balance would be, as you say, where you describe yourself as an Australian, but of Italian heritage or Calabrese heritage.
Yes.
And that's really what we should be striving for.
Yeah. And because you know what, when you do go back to Italy and you see your cousins there, right? You go, great place to visit. Would I really live here? You know what? Is this better than Australia? No, it's not. Beautiful country, great food, amazing fashion, fantastic designers. Would I live there? No, I've got it too good in Australia. And the way I think that is there's a lot of immigrants who think that as well.
Absolutely. And also I think the other aspect is that there's this romanticised view of what Italy and Calabria used to be because they've left.
Sure.
Forgetting the reasons why they've left. And so, we all say, oh, it'd be great to go back. But as you say, once you've been there for 2 months or 3 months, you say, oh, I can't cope.
Yeah.
I need to go back to some order.
Yes.
And that is, from what people I've spoken to, that appears to be quite a common reaction, not just from people from Australia, but people from Canada and people from the US.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Love it, love it, love it.
Yeah.
But it really isn't home.
And the thing is with the Canadians, because as you know, I spent a lot of time in Canada. For several years, I would spend 8-9 months of the year in Canada. Some of you may know I've got a daughter in Canada. So, I have a very close affiliation with Canada. Here, for us to get to Reggio Calabria, it's a 30-hour journey. Here to Bangkok, Bangkok to Rome, Rome down to Lamezia, another hour and a half by car. Add that up, it's 30 hours. Every June, July, or July, August in Canada, there is a flight that goes from Toronto straight to Lamezia, 8 hours. Thanks very much for coming. So because of that, it's almost a third of the time, more, even a quarter of the time it takes, they travel on a regular basis to Italy. So like in Australia, most people in Melbourne, they've got their holiday house in Mornington Peninsula, for example. A lot of Canadians have got their holiday house in Calabria or Sicily or Abruzzo or Napoli.
Yeah,
and they
that's
will fly and they'll
very
speak to
common. Yeah,
and they have that affinity, but yet they would still prefer to live in
yeah.
Canada.
The other subject I want to chat about with you
Yeah.
is in terms of humour
Hmm.
and the, well, let's call it for what it is, censorship of humour.
Yes.
In other
Yeah.
words,
Right.
being politically correct
The
and
cancel
not
culture.
trying to be
Yeah.
offensive,
Yeah.
which I've got to say, I find that very, very offensive in itself because
Yeah.
one of the functions of humour, in
Hmm.
fact, is to offend,
Yes.
especially if you want to draw attention to, prejudice or
Sure.
discrimination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, what do you think about the current sort of movement that, you know, comedians should not address certain topics because it's hurtful? And do you think any topic is off limits for?
Well, it's the same way as somebody says, "Are you offended by the word woke?"
Yeah,
Now, it depends on the tone that you use. If somebody's going to say Anglo-Saxon is going to say, "Oh, you're just a woke bastard," right? And that's an offensive tone. But I've got Aussie mates, you wogs are all the same, oh, here's my little wog mate. That's fine. I've got no problem with that. We did a show about this time last year, and in the show was Greeks, Italians, Turkish, an African American, and an Aboriginal. If you saw what went on backstage, if there were cameras, if there were hidden cameras with microphones that heard us taking the piss out of each other, what I would say to the Aboriginal guy, what he would say to me, what I would say to the African American, what he would say to me, it would blow your mind. But you know what? We say to each other the same things behind closed doors that people would say in public and have uproar about. But you know what? We leave the backstage and head to our cars, hugs, arms around each other. Why? Because we know it's a joke. It's a joke. Now, of course, things are, if somebody gets up and racially vilifies someone and has a go and calls them all sorts of names, and they're very derogatory, it's very,
but that's the point. There's a difference between using language to vilify, it
yeah,
seems to me,
yeah,
and using language as an aspect of humour.
yes, yeah.
And as long as one is using language as an aspect of humour, then I don't see any limits to it, quite frankly, because
No, my comedy tends to be pretty safe in terms of the fact that, it's a family show, it's a clean show. I talk about observational, it's very observational. It's about the family, funny things that happen to everybody in life. It's very interesting how, if you're very left wing, you've got your point of view. And if it's not that same point of view, they'll have a go at you. Um, and right wing sort of, that's sort of a view. A lot of people who have to be, a lot of artists and so on who are being interviewed on radio have to, whether they like it or not, whether that's their opinion or not, they have to fortify their opinion to make sure that they don't get in trouble with what they say. But what are people really thinking? That's where I like to lean towards. What are people really thinking? That's more important to me, right? What are the majority of people really thinking? Otherwise we all tend to be sheep here. But there's nothing wrong in challenging anything that you want to challenge, as long as it's done in such a way that it's not going to offend anybody and it gives it a fair go.
my concern is that, one hears about cancel culture, which
Mm.
effectively means that unless you tell me what I think I already know
Yeah.
and what I
What?
want to hear,
Yeah.
I don't want to hear you.
That's right, and that's
Well,
absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what's the point of having
what's the point?
humorists? What's the point of having social commentators?
Exactly.
What's the point of people having, of reviewing anything? I mean, we might as well just jump into the one boat and head onto the one island, and that's not what life is about. Humans are different. We have a different mind. We have a different way of thinking and looking at things. We need to encourage people to think and think outside the box, not what everyone else wants us to think.
And in terms of, just on a different aspect now, in terms of the future, are you moving to a different perspective in terms of your own work, or do you?
Yeah, well, it's always progressing. Okay, so, for the longest time, all I talked about was nonna and nonna. Then I started including my parents in the show. And then when I became a father, I started to talk about being a dad, how my parents now have become grandparents. And then, of course, through that whole mix came the internet, and how the internet, and seeing my dad sending text messages. How my mum is now on Facebook, and she writes, she sees a picture of me with a girl, and she's got to write a comment, I'm not liking this again, right? And now we're about to have another child in Australia. And my parents, I'm going to see them become nonny even more, because my daughter lives in Canada, so it's a little bit hard to see them on a full-time basis be nonny. But now I'm going to see them even more. Now I'm going to experience being a full-time dad, and I'm already thinking of stuff. I mean, already having a look at these toys. We had a baby shower and a baby bunting, and there's all these toys.
But they're all toys you had in your childhood.
No, I don't have half of this stuff. It's like, even today, like the kids are so rich. We have to be home by 7. The child's got to be home by 8.
Yeah.
When I was growing up with my cousins, we used to play until we dropped. So, it'd be 11 o'clock at night. I'd be sleeping in my mum's arms under the dining table while the old men used to play the cards, smoking in the house.
Yeah.
I remember driving my nonno's car. No, did you hear what I said?
Yeah.
Not driving in my nonno's car, driving my nonno's car on his lap,
Yeah.
on the steering wheel, no belt. My nonno had no, because every Italian back then had a carta do medico that said they don't need the belt, because there was always had, right? Everyone, my nonno would get pulled over. Oh, a carta, car. I don't need the belt.
Yeah.
Smoking.
Yeah.
Like, there's a gag right there, Vincent. You know what I mean? And so that's going to evolve, and then the way that our life was compared to the way these kids' life were is, like I say in the show, they got iPads, we had Wogdads. They got apps and we got slaps. They got Google, had Safari, and we had Kumari, right? So that's where it's evolving.
That's true. And you say you're planning a show, you're writing a show. When does it come on?
So at the moment, I assume it'll start touring. We'll do a country run around about February, March next year, and then we'll hit the major cities.
Oh, I'm looking.
And it's my 25th anniversary.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be a big one.
Again, the other memorable thing about that 20th anniversary tour, which is, I think, indicating you tell the story where you arrived early at the theatre to do an audio and lighting check.
Yeah.
And went outside, and this young lady approaches you and says, "Oh, are you Joe Avati?" And terrific, as you say. I've still got it. And then she said, "Oh,"
and mind you, she was gorgeous. She was beautiful, stunning girl. Oh my God, you're Joe Avati. I've still got it. And then she said, "My nonna loves you."
Well, there you go. There's that great intergenerational span, Joe.
Yeah,
It's going to get even better in the future.
Yeah.
Look, we've gone a bit over time, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent,
for participating, and I'm looking forward to seeing the show next year. And I wish you all the best in the future. And thanks again.
Thank you, mate. Thanks very much for having me. I'm very proud to be Calabrese.
Yeah, as we all. Thank you very much.